One of the fun facts often trotted out about the Mongols is that they wore silk undershirts which provided them protection against arrows, swords, and bacteria. But this is neither fun nor a fact. Today, I'm going to show you this popular claim has little basis in the historical sources. Previous efforts to examine it have focused on the actual mechanics of an arrow hitting silk. I'm not going to pretend that I can do that, as I do not have any 13th century bows, arrows, or silk in my possession. But what I do have is years of experience with both the historical sources and historiography of the Mongol Empire. And neither myself, nor any other historian of the Mongol Empire, or specialists in medieval arms and armor that I have spoken to, has ever found a medieval source which supports the Mongols wearing silk shirts for their defensive qualities. Neither is there evidence for the average Mongol having his own silk shirt even at the height of the conquests. The claim appears to be a creation of the 20th century, but influenced by cases where silk was used to protect against projectiles. In an accompanying video to release within this next week, I will list for you some historical examples of how silk was incorporated into armor, and you will see how they compare to the myth. The claim is that the Mongols wore specially designed silk shirts underneath their armor which provided them protection from enemy attacks, most usually arrows. The most extreme version is that silk repelled knives, swords, and arrows in addition to being lightweight and comfortable. That's just mithril. The two most common tellings are as follows. First, that the silk simply stops the arrow entirely and allows no penetration. The second is that the arrow does enter the body, but fails to cut the silk, pushing the silk into the wound, which minimizes harm and makes removal easier. The usual suggested mechanism for this is that the spinning of the arrow causes the silk to wind up around it on contact and absorb the impact. This also stops infection as no threads or bits of arrow are left behind to fester in the wound. The least common version is that the arrow cuts clean through the silk but doesn't carry any fabric with it. Therefore, no nasty bits of fabric are left in the flesh. I've had my doubts on this claim for years, which is why I didn't include it in my video on Mongol arms and armor. There's a lot of descriptions over how filthy and unwashed Mongol clothing was, especially on campaign. Probably any antibacterial qualities of silk are cancelled out by having the garment worn for months on end and covered in sweat, blood, and dirt. A single silk undershirt right against the skin never seemed to me sufficient to actually affect an arrow. Silk is a wonderful material, but it will still be cut. How else do you get it into a shirt? As Timothy May noted, if the Chinese had such effective anti-arrow silk, you'd think they would have fared much better against the Mongols, Khitans, or Jurchen. Not surprisingly, when I asked people knowledgeable in medieval Chinese arms and armor, they knew of no such protective silk shirts. Since the claim is that these shirts were an invention by the Chinese stolen by the Mongols, it's rather suspicious there isn't a record of it in Chinese sources. I will link below two experiments that tested the claims practically and found the arrows easily penetrated the silk. Now, of course, neither is a one-to-one recreation of an arrow striking a man on horseback in the midst of battle. But in the video and attached document of Grouchy Mongol, you'll see his efforts to account for variables, including different types of silk, replica Turco Mongolian broadhead arrows, and a bow of appropriate poundage. He found that the silk and linen layers could offer resistance against blunt target tip arrows, but against arrows with proper warheads, the textiles were deeply punctured each time and never dragged into the wound. Only resistance came with the addition of leather armor. Even then, the arrows still punctured armor, cloth, and flesh, just not as deeply. And even if the person was wearing metal armor, such as lamellar, silk will have little use. The arrow is unlikely to actually puncture the metal, so the silk would still be struck through some sort of gap in the armor. While these aren't an exact reproduction, I believe these demonstrate the principle well enough. A simple silk shirt against the skin won't stop a war arrow and won't accompany it into the wound. In the comments of these videos, some defenders claim it's supposed to be a layered coat or gambeson made of silk. Now, of course, padded textile armors are historical, but these are hardly just a shirt, as the myth claims. They are in fact just armor, and usually quite thick. Aside from a gambeson of silk being ludicrously expensive and unattested in the sources, the Mongols already had thick quilted coats of felt to wear. Now all of that is just modern testing, but these discussions rarely ask, what are the actual primary sources for the claim? As already noted, neither myself nor any historian I know has seen it within a historical source. What you'll see is people usually get it from James Chambers' The Devil's Horseman, published in 1979. While popular and sharply written, historians do not have a high opinion of the work. Full of factual errors, out-of-date claims from the 1800s, and taking little account of historiography of the time, it's simply not a suitable book for serious discussions on the Mongol Empire. But it sold very well, so here we are. Chambers rarely provides citations for his information, including his claim about the silk shirts. I could not find an earlier mention of it until the grouchy Mongol found it in Frank Trippett's 1974 book, The First Horseman. By comparing the bibliography of Trippett and Chambers, I was able to trace it to E.D. Phillips' 1969 The Mongols, and from there to the 1940 English translation of Michael Provden's The Mongol Empire, Its Rise and Legacy, first published in 1938 as Chinggis Khan und seine Erbe, which itself was a reprint of his two earlier volumes. The claim first appears in his 1934 book Chinggis Khan Sturm über Asien. Provden provides no citation or hint as to where he learned it. And as of the time of this writing, Provden's book is the earliest reference I have found connecting this claim with the Mongols. Nothing in Provden's bibliography that I have been able to access has it. In the 80-odd years since the initial publication, I have not found another book which connects this claim to a writer predating Provden or to a primary source. In the case of writers like Phillips and Trippett, their writing matches Provden almost exactly, both in how the sentence is formatted and its placement. For all of these books place it just as Chinggis Khan sets out against Khwarezm in 1219. The only additional bit of information was added in 1979 when James Chambers makes the silk wind up around the arrow due to spinning. I have found no reference to this before Chambers. To be clear then, the detail of the Mongols wearing a silk shirt as protection against arrows has not been found in any writing predating the 1930s. Provden is in many respects similar to these other writers. He had a book written very well, which sold very well, and holds a low status in scholarship. Even at the time, Mongolists and sinologists critiqued Provden's factual errors, poor sourcing, out-of-date information, and misrepresentation of sources. The most consistent critique has always been that Provden loved to put exact quotes into people's mouths, or look into their thoughts without evidence to support any of it. Provden set out to write a readable history which blurred the line with a novel. That makes for good reading, but not necessarily good history. He is the 1930s equivalent of a YouTube video called Genghis Khan, Biggest Badass, which has information decades out of date and maps of the wrong Jin dynasty. My suspicion is that Provden got this from no medieval source on the Mongols, but something much more recent. For that, we have to go to the Wild West. In 1887, an American named George E. Goodfellow published a short article called Notes on the Impenetrability of Silk. It lists 3 persons he had examined who had suffered gunshot wounds but had the bullets obstructed in some manner by their silk handkerchiefs, though only one of them survived. Mr. Goodfellow's description of what he found is extremely similar to how Provden describes the silk shirts he gives the Mongols. I can't say if Provden had access to Goodfellow's article, or if it ever circulated outside of America. It's not impossible that Provden heard it indirectly and simply recalled it from somewhere. But Provden did have one example in Europe. In 1897, a Polish inventor in Chicago, Casimir Zeglein, received the patent for bulletproof silk vests. There's debate if Zeglein had access to Goodfellow or not. Regardless, Zeglain spent a few years developing it, and by the end of the 1890s was showing it in the US and Europe. The vest had some success against revolvers of the time, though even when reinforced with steel plates, could not stand up to rifles. One test of this steel plate vest was revealing. Soldiers shot the side with the steel plates first, and utterly destroyed the vest. As the bullet punctured the steel, the edges of the hole turned out into the silk, cutting it. I suspect that for our hypothetical Mongol, an arrow strong enough to punch a hole through metal armor would have similar effect. None of Zeglain's accounts of owners surviving shootings are verified. He claims Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary had one, but that didn't really do him much good, did it? Zeglain's vests, despite quite some news coverage, never caught on. For one thing, they were incredibly expensive. These vests in 1914 cost some $800 USD, over $23,000 in 2022. The vests were marketed primarily for politicians, secondary to police and military, to be worn discreetly underneath their usual clothing. Zeglain's shirts were not entirely silk. They were layers of wool, cotton felt, silk, pasteboard, and linen of varying thicknesses and woven together in particular ways. This particular weaving made it strong against bullets, not simply the silk itself. The idea of silk clothing worn underneath regular clothing to protect against projectiles is clearly echoed in Provden's writing in the early 1930s. Provden's book more or less combines Goodfellow's account of the silk being pushed into the wound with the discreet protection offered by Zeglain's silk vests. Provden did not see the Mongols as mindless barbarians, but actually tried to show Chinggis Khan as a statesman. His forces not undisciplined brutes, but efficient, technologically competent and highly mobile armies. Provden wanted to show the Mongols having a technical edge over their foes. So perhaps finding a source mentioning silk being worn by the Mongols, Provden simply may have made the leap that the only reason they had to wear silk was a military one. Deciding upon this, Provden needed a frame of reference for how protective silk would be worn, and it appears he drew from modern examples, even if indirectly, of Goodfellow and Zeglain, to create the silk shirts we see in his own books. Provden simply switched out a bullet for an arrow in the description and assumed the result would be the same. But is there even evidence for all the Mongols wearing silk? Well, actually, the sources portray silk in the Mongol Empire being worn only by the elite. From the accounts of European travelers to the Mongol Empire like John de Plano Carpini and William of Rubruck, to Song dynasty envoys like Peng Daya and Shu Ting, silk garments are only mentioned explicitly in connection with the nobility and the military elite. William of Rubruck, who traveled to the court of Grand Khan Menka in the 1250s, contrasts how wealthy Mongols lined their clothing with silk compared to poorer Mongols who had to make do with cotton and wool. Marco Polo was Kublai Khan gifting silk robes to his nobles and keshig on festivals. Peng Daya and Shu Ting specify how the bokta of Mongol noblewomen was made of and decorated with silk. Peng Daya does say Mongols wore robes of rami and silk instead of their older ones of felt, furs, and leather, but in his context he isn't really talking about the entire Mongol people, but the elite and leadership that, as an envoy, he spent most of his time with. His line about not distinguishing between noble and base ranks by their clothes is a reference to the Mongols, both high and low, all still wearing their traditional garment, ladel. Though identical in appearance, now the ruling classes were made out of finer materials. In all of the sources which I have ever read, not a single one has silk for the average Mongol. An outfit made of silk remained in the Mongol Empire a high-status garment, not something handed out to Mongol troops. We see silk given as a reward for meritorious service. Peng Daya's 1230s account records how the government bestowed horses, garga, or lengths of silk to victorious soldiers. There's little evidence for the Mongol government supplying the average trooper with anything except arrows. Each Mongol had to provide his own equipment. A prince or khan may equip and dress his actual bodyguard or keshig to show his wealth and ensure he was well protected. But that's a general reality of armies before uniforms. Certainly, nothing stopped the Mongol from looting himself new equipment or even silk clothing. But that doesn't result in standardized kit. In our multiple, detailed descriptions of Mongol equipment from eyewitnesses of the 13th century, silk garments never appear. John de Plano Carpini's description from 1246 is among the most well-known, and he makes no mention of silk whatsoever, but comments upon how effective he thinks the actual Mongol armor was. So what did the Mongols do with all that silk they looted or took as tax and tribute? Much simply went to the aristocracy. One of Grand Councillor Yelu Chutsai's arguments to prevent dividing North China into princely appanages was to pay the Mongol princes yearly allowances of gold and silk, because he knew the princes loved it. The Chinggisid Khans and princes put that shit on everything, especially in the form of nazij, a silk thread interwoven with gold. The nobility used silk for tens of thousands of robes, headdresses, decorations, belts, ropes, and twine, the lighting of their gers, and covers for royal wagons. Silk covered their saddles and horse tack, and a surviving 13th century Mongolian bow has its string of silk thread. Weavers and silk producers were transplanted across the empire to supply the Altan Urag. By 1221, Chinese weavers were forced to new communities in Mongolia, the former Khwarezmian Empire, and even up into the Yenisei River Valley. But one of the most important medieval functions of silk was its currency. In China, taxes were paid in silver and silk, which the Mongols continued. The banknotes Kublai Khan issued, for example, were backed by silk. The Mongols, like all steppe nomads, loved merchants. Merchants, usually Central Asian Muslims, brought foreign wares, resources, textiles, and spices to Mongolia, as well as information. Many of these merchant partners were brought into the Mongol government and became top administrators of the empire. In exchange, the Mongols spent much of their silver and silk on these merchants. To encourage them to make the hard trek into Mongolia and Karakoram, the Mongols greatly overpaid them. In turn, they brought silk westwards to sell. Ferdinand von Richthofen didn't call it the Silk Road, ironically. Silk was involved in the very running of the Mongol Empire, collected in tax, paid or rewarded to government officials, to procuring supplies for government needs. Silk also had a ritual use. For example, Buddhist monasteries received large donations of silk from Chinese and Mongol governments. This was spent or used to make banners, sutra covers, and robes. In the Yuan dynasty, the court used it for Confucian ceremony. For the Mongol government, there was no reason to dress the army in silk, considering that the Khans wanted it, the government needed it, and the soldiers were expected to outfit themselves. All information suggests only a small part of the Mongol army, the nobility, their guards, and the few troops who looted or could afford it, wore silk clothing onto the battlefield. And the reason for that had nothing to do with protection against arrows. This was the job of their armor or existing gambeson-like thickly padded coats. Instead, they wore silk for the same reason anyone else did: the prestige and comfort of it. It's simply a nice material, light, and helps manage your body's temperature. That is an advantage on the battlefield, but it isn't exactly stopping an arrow. Cost put it out of reach of the average soldier. In this respect, Zeglane's expensive silk vests weren't too dissimilar, for these were also marketed to imperial courts rather than average Joes or Batars. So when someone claims that the average Mongol soldier walked around in a coat or gambeson made of layers of silk, understand just how immensely expensive that would be. A fellow with that kind of wealth could just buy himself lamalar and a padded hatanga underneath, which would offer much more protection against weapons than a silk robe. So let's summarize what we've covered. A silk shirt on its own does nothing against an arrow with a cutting edge. A gambeson of silk can't stop an arrow, but entire silk gambesons are unattested in the sources and would be monstrously expensive. References to Mongols wearing silk are restricted to the elite, and more generally, silk tills or other robes, or just covering everything else they owned. The actual myth, a silk shirt resisting an arrow's impact, appears to be a creation of Michael Provden in 1934, taking actual recorded effectiveness of silk in silk vests against buckshot and round bullets, and transforming this into a silk shirt worn underneath clothing. The continued promotion of this myth reflects how some people view history purely through military material. That is, war is only ever an arms race. Hence, the 100,000 discussions about whichever tank is supposed to have won World War II. Likewise, people have wanted to explain the Mongol conquests via a Wunderwaffen, which gave them an edge over their neighbors. I've seen people claim this was stirrups, gunpowder, cannons, Chinggis Khan inventing horseback archery, and silk shirts. Basically, that the Mongols had one neat trick which allowed them to conquer all of those places. It's easy and fits with the belief that everything in the past existed just for a war. It's a bit like the idea that pirates just buried all of their treasure instead of spending it. People like nice things, and it's convenient to pay for them rather than kill everyone for them. That's kind of why they're looting these things in the first place. In this, the Mongols were no exception. There will be another video coming out in the next week about historical uses of silk in armors. So if you got this far, wait for that. Smash the like button or something. I don't know.